Ladies and gentlemen, let us start the first session on the theme of climate crisis and global leadership. I would like to introduce to you the moderator of this session, the co-chair of the Seoul Climate Energy Conference, Kim Sang-hyuk. He is currently the president of the Jeju Research Institute and a visiting professor at the KAIST Graduate School of Green Growth. He is also the founder of Coalition for Our Common Future.
Okay, Good morning, everyone, and good afternoon, good evening, someone around the world. Well, welcome to the Seoul Climate Energy Conference. This is the 7th annual conference since 2014. And I'm really thrilled more than ever before because at last, US is coming to the stage of climate actions with the leadership of the President-elect, Mr. Joe Biden. US is going to re-engage with the Paris Agreement and will announce its own carbon-neutral net zero plan by the year 2050. And US is going to invest hugely on clean technology, clean energy, and clean infrastructure. And to demonstrate the political will of the President-elect Joe Biden, he appointed Mr. John Kerry, the former Secretary of the State, as a special envoy for climate change. And Mr. John Kerry is expected to join the National Security Council, which means a lot. The US is going to regard the climate issue, not just environmental issues, but also national security issues and also global industrial issues. Well, having said that, that's why we set up the first session is going to deal with climate crisis and global leadership. I don't think I need to talk about the climate crisis, but the more we know about the pandemic which we are suffering, there's close interconnections between the pandemic and climate change. To solve this kind of global problems, we of course need global cooperation, global governance, and global leadership. For that, we have wonderful speakers. We have 5 keynote speakers from David Victor, the professor of San Diego, and we have Mr. Kim Jung-il, the Director General of Energy Innovation, representing Ministry of Trade, Industry, and Energy, Korea. We have Mr. Alistair Rich, who is the Director of Asia Pacific Sustainability at the Asia Society Policy Institute. And for our discussion, we have Mr. Lee Dong-gyu, the Director General of International Cooperation and Science and Technology Bureau at the National Council on Climate Change and Environment. And we have Professor Shim Sang-min of the Korea National Diplomatic Academy. So let's go to Professor David Victor, who is a man behind the scene. He is the professor of San Diego, and he's also a co-director at the Laboratory on International Law and Regulation and co-director at the UC San Diego Deep Decarbonization Initiative. And he is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institute and also the Council of Foreign Relations. Okay, he is going to deliver a keynote speech with the title of Global Climate Policy Leadership after Paris and the incoming Biden administration. And the screen is yours, David.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, my friend Sang-hyuk, for the invitation. And it's really terrific to be back here again to the Seoul Climate Energy Conference. So I want to talk today about where we are with regard to climate change policy and leadership, and what we should think about the role of the incoming Biden administration. The Paris conference is just approaching its 5th birthday, and so like all 5-year-olds, it's showing a lot of promise, and it also there's a lot of development that's still needed. And I think there's a tremendous amount of enthusiasm right now, given the change in the U.S. Leadership, and I share that enthusiasm. But I think we need to be realistic about the enormity of the task in front of us. And when we grapple with that, the enormity of that task, we also, I think we'll have clearer thinking about what the right strategy is for us globally, including the right strategy to expect from the incoming U.S. administration. The task is really big in front of us. There have been a lot of very important announcements, including from Korea with the net zero announcement most recently. But when you take a step back and look at the numbers, the gap that lies between where we are right now and where we need to be is huge. This is a slide from the most recent International Energy Agency World Energy Outlook, came out in October, just about the time, just prior to the Korean announcement of its net zero pledge. It shows along the top here emissions of carbon dioxide from industrial sources over time out into the future under current policies, and then looks at what happens if you have implementation of existing policies, implementation of the China net zero target, you have further implementation of the Korean net zero target that comes down a little bit beyond that. But there's still a very large gap between what's going on right now and what is needed. And as previous speakers have said, the atmosphere as of yet doesn't actually know that we are talking a lot about climate change issues. It doesn't even know that we've in the middle of a huge global economic recession where emissions this year will be down by about 8% compared with previous years. Here are data just from a couple days ago from a monitoring station, the longest continuing monitoring station that's run by some of my colleagues here at La Jolla, California. The monitoring station happens to be on top of a volcano in Hawaii, and it measures the atmosphere and has this famous sawtooth pattern as concentrations go up. The atmosphere has not noticed that we've been going to conferences. It did not notice that we have gone to Paris. It has not noticed the pandemic this year. And so we really, the inertia in the climate system continues to move in the direction of more buildup of carbon dioxide and more climate change. So that part of the diagnosis, I think, is now widely known. I think we need to be a lot more careful now as to how we are going to make progress. Why is it that we haven't, frankly, made more progress so far? And I think the reason fundamentally is technological. It's the technological frontier. So long as we are not pushing the technological frontier as far as we can, then all the politics of climate change become much, much harder to manage. The problem is more expensive to address. Interest groups, especially anchored in incumbent industries that have high emissions, are very well organized. They're going to block progress. So let me show you one slide that gives you a sense of where we are in terms of pushing the technological frontier, because once we understand that diagnosis, then I think some of the strategies that we should be following come into better focus. This is from a study that was released almost a year ago at the last COP. It seems like decades ago, given everything that's happened in the global economy over the last year, but this was released at the Madrid Conference of Parties from a team of us that includes a historian of technology, myself, a political scientist, Simon Sharp from the British government. And one of the things we did there is we looked at the characteristic patterns by which new technologies come into service. New technologies begin taking over market share, and they have a very small market share in niche markets, and they get better in those markets, and they improve through learning. We have early technologies, and they gradually gain market share. And then they take off more widely into more widespread diffusion. And then finally, they reconfigure their world such that the new technologies, superior technologies, take over, extinguish the old technologies, and then rewrite the rules to make sure the old technologies don't come back. What we need in the case of climate change is, in effect, a series of technological revolutions by which fledgling technologies in niche markets today in a whole bunch of different sectors of the economy emerge, improve, diffuse into more widespread service, and then reconfigure the world into a world that is very low carbon technological attributes indeed. One of the things we did in this study is we looked at the 10 major sectors of existing large emitting technologies and asked, where are they on the S-shaped curve? And the power sector is doing pretty well. Light duty vehicles are starting to become more widely available, at least in a few countries, low emission, essentially zero emission vehicles, which I think today's technology suggests it's going to be electricity. Buildings maybe a little bit back from that. But what's to me is very interesting is that almost all the technologies are still very far from the technological frontier. We have to change this picture if we're going to make the politics of climate change easier to manage, and if we're going to make it easier for governments to take their pledges of net zero and turn them into reality. Because frankly, it's pretty easy to pledge net zero. It's pretty hard to turn those pledges into actual reality. That requires a lot of things, but it hinges upon a necessary condition is pushing the technological frontier. So what do we know about the kinds of international cooperation strategies that can push that technological frontier? And I think we know roughly three things. The first thing we know is that you need to break big problems down into smaller ones. It's frankly not helpful to spend a lot of time talking about general goals for emissions reduction. We have to work sector by sector. What we need in the steel sector is going to be different from what we need in plastics. What we need in energy carriers for electricity is going to be different from what we need in the potential new energy carrier or competitive energy carrier of hydrogen. What we need for light duty vehicles is going to be very different from what we need in aircraft. And we can't engage in problem solving until we take the big problem and break it down into smaller ones. The second thing we know is that it's going to be easier to do that in small groups of countries and firms. President of KAIST quoted Albert Einstein. Let me paraphrase Albert Einstein's famous comment about theories, which is we need to work in the smallest group possible, but no smaller. We need to identify the countries, the governments, and the firms that are willing to be pioneers in these small groups to push the technological frontier in steel and push the technological frontier in light duty vehicles, push the technological frontier in hydrogen, and on and on and on. And the last thing we need to grapple with is the reality that we don't know what to do. The more profound the technological changes, the harder it is to make a plan. What we need to be doing is running a whole series of experiments and figuring out what works and what doesn't work. So I think that's in essence what comes from the study of successful international cooperation and dealing with these kinds of problems where the problem fundamentally requires a reconfiguration of the technological frontier. To me, one of the things that's interesting is if you go out to the international system and you ask yourself, what are the institutions that can help us, the organizations that can help us, they come in roughly two flavors. They come in institutions that are very big. This chart shows from the same study we released in Madrid, the membership of international institutions on the horizontal axis, and the vertical axis shows us the extent to which the institution actually does very much for cooperation, for deep cooperation. We have a lot of institutions that are really big that don't do very much, frankly, in terms of deep cooperation. And we have some institutions that are small membership that actually do a huge amount. And so that, I think, is crucial as we think about the future. And it's crucial as we think about how we engage with the new Biden administration. This is a picture taken a couple of days ago of the new foreign policy team. I'm thrilled that the team is going to be rejoining the Paris Agreement. And I think lots of governments around the world, including the Korean government, are looking for how do we cooperate with the new Biden administration. I think the key to success here is to recognize that foreign policy in the US is relatively easy because it's entirely in the control, almost entirely in the control of the executive, the president. Much harder to develop new pieces of legislation. And so my answer to the question of what to expect from the Biden administration and how to help them do things that are more productive is to look along this curve here and to identify the sectors where there's a value added from the US cooperating with Korea, cooperating with China, and so on. And I think there's actually a huge amount on the power sector and light duty vehicles and hydrogen and a few other areas. There's a lot that the US can offer. And the only other thing I'd say about that is don't just look at Washington, DC, but also look at the states, because a huge amount is happening in the states. For example, in California, where I live, you have a natural partner to push the technological frontier, for example, with regard to light duty vehicles and the phase out of old internal combustion engines. And the last thing I'll say as I close is I believe this problem is fundamentally a problem of pushing the technological frontier and making cooperation easier by lowering the cost of new technologies. But we must not forget that this leadership problem is also a followership problem. In 1990, about 1/3 of global emissions came from countries like Korea, parts of the United States, most of Europe, countries that would be reliable leaders on the climate change problem, shown here in the green wedge for 1990. In the year 2005, that had shrunk to about 2/5. And today, that's now about 1/4 or less and shrinking. And that's the core irony of the climate change problem, which is that the more you do as a leader, sadly, the less relevant you become to the problem. And so we've got to push the technological frontier. That's essential. And then we have to remember that we have to create incentives and mechanisms by which the leaders generate followers in the rest of the world. And that, I think, is going to be the test for COP26. COP26 will come, COP26 will go. The big news will be the re-engagement of the United States, and we need to re-engage the United States in a way that helps push that technological frontier and then helps bring along the rest of the global economy such that the entire world's energy system decarbonizes as rapidly as possible. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I myself have a higher hope for next year's COP26 with the participation of the U.S. Well, before we invite Mr. Kim Jong-il and have interactive discussion, I'd like to ask a brief question to David Victor, just for a minute. Hello, David.
Yes, hello.
Please tell us what does it mean for Mr. John Kerry to join the White House as a special envoy and National Security Council? What does it mean? I know you are a good friend of Mr. John Kerry and many climate leaders, including Mr. Jerry Brown, the former governor of California. I know you know what it means, but please tell us.
Well, I think it's tremendously good news because John Kerry has a huge amount of experience as Secretary of State, our foreign minister, in working with other countries and putting climate change at the top of the agenda. And I'm very confident that given his new role, which will focus entirely on climate change and the foreign policy dimensions, that he's going to be out there putting those deals together. But he's going to need help from Korea, which is a leader in this topic, from China, who's emerged as a leader. He's going to need help identifying things that we can actually do together that push the frontier as opposed to just getting together and talking.
Okay, great. We will be talking about that, how to deepen our cooperation with the U.S., China, Korea, etc. We will be talking about that. Now, I'm going to invite Mr. Kim Jong-il for the speech. The title is The Green New Deal and the New Energy Innovation and How to Cooperate with the U.S. Please, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Kim. Good morning and good evening to those in the United States. As introduced, my name is Jong-il Kim, and I'm the Director General for Energy Innovation Policy at the Ministry of Trade, Industry, and Energy of the Republic of Korea. I'd like to begin by extending my sincere gratitude to President Sang-hyuk Kim of the Jeju Research Institute for this wonderful opportunity to address you today. As you are all experiencing at firsthand, the world is currently facing tremendous uncertainties caused by COVID-19. And depending on how long the pandemic will last, it could bring more challenges to not only our economy and society, but also climate changes and the overall energy sector. It is, therefore, both timely and meaningful to hold today's conference under the theme of green finance and business creation in the climate crisis era. Living in an increasingly interconnected world, we have all witnessed how quickly the virus has spread to every corner of the globe, resulting in a severe public health and economic crisis. And this has brought about a series of dire consequences, such as sluggish demand and supply disruptions in the economy, as well as trade and movement restrictions. Against this backdrop, the Korean government has swiftly yet preemptively responded to this unprecedented crisis with the conviction that no quarantine measures will mean no economic recovery. With this principle in mind, Korea has implemented strict quarantine measures by fully utilizing its rapid diagnostic tools, transparent disclosure of relevant information, and ICT-based epidemic surveillance. And thanks to such measures, Korea has seen significant progress. we are now gradually normalizing our economy and returning to everyday life without having once imposed a complete lockdown. As such, our rapid and effective policy measures, buttressed by our strong manufacturing industry, have played a key role in overcoming this global crisis. The data speaks for itself. According to the IMF, Korea is expected to achieve the greatest economic growth this year among all OECD member countries, and our electricity consumption in September increased by 3.4% year on year. Each time I reflect upon the many pending yet pressing issues, such as COVID-19 or climate change, I wonder what might have happened if humanity had turned our attention towards climate change and the environment at a much earlier stage. In fact, the word green has long been at the epicenter of global climate change solutions and has recently been in limelight with the global trend towards a green recovery. And I have no doubt that this green movement will only grow stronger as the COVID-19 pandemic shows no signs of abating. Indeed, many prestigious institutions such as Oxford University, IEA, and Bloomberg are all highlighting the importance of a comprehensive recovery package, combining economic stimulus and a climate change response. Already, Germany, France, and many other countries have announced ambitious recovery packages focused on future mobility, energy transition, and job creation. Korea's Green New Deal announced in last July is also in line with this global trend. It is a national economic recovery plan that will enable Korea to take the initiative in the global economy by spearheading growth and transforming its economic and social structures. And like many others, I believe that energy is the key pillar of the Korean Green New Deal. Given Korea's energy intensive structure, a clean energy transition will deliver tremendous ripple effects across the entire nation. Specifically, Korea will accelerate our energy transition and invest more in energy infrastructure by allocating $60 billion over the next 5 years into the eco-friendly and low-carbon sector. This will contribute to establishing a sustainable and safer energy mix, smart and resilient energy distribution systems, and more efficient energy consumption patterns, ultimately enabling Korea to move towards carbon neutrality. As you may be aware, Korea differs from many other advanced economies as we experienced a relatively shorter period of industrialization and a surge in greenhouse gas emissions up until very recently. However, as the Korean economy has now joined the ranks of advanced countries in terms of GDP and trade volume, the international community has higher expectations for Korea's early transition towards a green economy than ever. And with the EU and US President-elect Joe Biden reviewing the introduction of a carbon border tax, Korea likewise must fulfill our duty as a responsible member of the international community and accelerate our efforts towards ushering in a green future. In this sense, I have no doubt that the Korean Green New Deal is a must for the sustainability of the Korean economy, as well as the global competitiveness of domestic businesses. Along with green recovery, carbon neutrality has recently entered into the lexicon of the global community. During his presidential campaign, Mr. Biden promised to achieve carbon neutrality in the power sector by 2035 and all sectors by 2050. The EU also declared its commitment to this very same goal at the end of last year, closely followed by China and Japan. Korea has also set its sights on carbon neutrality, and to this end, we believe that reducing fossil fuel-based power, wider deployment of CCUS, greater roles for renewables and green hydrogen, and better energy efficiency on the demand side, such as vehicles and buildings, will play a pivotal role. I expect that the US, China, and Japan are no exceptions. However, achieving carbon neutrality is easier said than done. With existing technologies, this remains extremely challenging and difficult, and no one country is able to achieve this goal alone. We all have different technology strength and policy experiences. This is where international cooperation comes in. We must share our best practices and technologies and combine our efforts to let a new era of carbon neutrality come as early as possible. In particular, Korea and the US have long maintained a close partnership and achieved many together. Such important successes has laid a solid foundation for technological collaboration between the two countries. For instance, Apple and Korean manufacturers in parts and materials. Our achievements should not stop here. This time around, I hope that Korea and the US will once again make another history in the Green Revolution. Both the Korean and the incoming US administration value the important role of renewables, hydrogen, and CCUS, and I very much look forward to close bilateral collaboration in these sectors. As Korea, along with our neighbors, is highly dependent upon fossil fuels with a small share of renewables and a manufacturing-driven economy, we face greater challenges on our journey towards carbon neutrality when compared to the US and the European Union. With these similarities in mind, if Korea, China, and Japan can engage in close cooperation and share best examples and policies, we can make further headway on the path towards green future. In this sense, I hope the same spirit of cooperation that we demonstrated in the recently signed RCEP will also shine through in our shared goal of carbon neutrality. On a final note, I would like to remind you of the saying, a blessing in disguise. We can always find a way out and turn every crisis into an opportunity. Back in 1997, during the Asian financial crisis, and then again in 2008 during the global financial crisis, Korea identified a breakthrough solution and achieved economic growth. This does not only apply to the economic sector. The world is facing unprecedented challenges caused by COVID-19 and climate change. However, if we continue to work side by side and pool our wisdom, we will surely find the blessing in disguise and pass on this blessed planet to the next generation. Warren Buffett once said, "You only find out who is swimming naked when the tide goes out." Over the past three centuries of industrialization, it never occurred to us that the tide would one day go out, as we were too busy swimming in an ocean filled to the brim with fossil fuels. However, the tide has slowly begun to go out and has left us stranded with COVID-19 and frequent abnormal weather events. When the time comes and the tide goes out, we will see who was swimming naked or not. And I have no doubt that Korea, the US, and other neighboring countries will be found wearing the finest and best swimsuit. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Director Kim. I hope we are not naked at all and wearing a proper swimming suit. As you are the key Director General for energy as a whole, so Professor David Victor identified several sectors for us to have a deeper cooperation with the US. Well, among many others, well, low carbon vehicles and hydrogen and power sector, etc. If you had to single out one important area for the US and Korea to have deeper collaboration, what would that be? It could be many,
Well,
but yeah.
There should be many, and as I briefly mentioned in my speech, Korea and the US have maintained and developed a very strong partnership
Yes.
in various technological fields, such as ICT technologies and manufacturing technologies. And recently, we have initiated our bilateral cooperation in such as green technologies,
Okay.
including future vehicles and renewable technologies. So all of these areas could be the promising areas for the bilateral cooperation. And fortunately, the Korean government and the incoming Biden administration have many values to share in the green future and to tackling down the challenges of the climate changes.
Okay.
So with these Green New Deals that had just announced in Korea last July, I'm very confident that the Korea and the United States will be committed to and will be finding the ways to identify and develop the bilateral cooperation in the future.
Thank you very much. Now, I'd like to invite Mr. Alistair Rich, the director of the Asia Society Policy Institute. Mr. Rich has done a great job, especially he held a very meaningful dialogue on carbon market cooperation in using emission trading schemes. Many countries are now using emission trading scheme. China, first time in Korea, and China and Japan, regionally, partially, and for the United States, California. So it would be very good for us to hear from him about the carbon market cooperation and carbon pricing and the role of the leaders in the world. Yes?
Thank you very much, President Sang-hyuk Kim, and it's a real pleasure to be invited to this conference and to have the opportunity to speak. So, as you've introduced, I'll share some lessons around carbon pricing, in particular emissions trading systems.
Yes.
And also the leadership roles that we would like the US and China to show. So, firstly, on carbon pricing, we've heard from the previous speakers about some of the drivers for carbon pricing in terms of how trade policies are increasingly interacting with climate policies. For example, the carbon border adjustment mechanism that the EU is proposing to adopt will be a big driver for jurisdictions to scale up their ambition. And we all know that the Paris Agreement itself is a big driver for scaling up ambition to achieve the goals through ambitious long-term targets, the net zero targets that we've heard about, and the medium-term targets for 2030. And this all needs cost-effective policies. And this is where the emissions trading system fits in. It's cost-effective at achieving deep reductions in GHG emissions. It guarantees the reductions. It safeguards competitiveness of industry. And also it provides a mechanism to fund GHG mitigation technology. So what we're seeing is some interesting developments. If we look at the EU, firstly, we can see that next year they will be looking to strengthen their emissions trading system to align with the net zero goals by tightening the ETS cap. In the US, the California cap and trade is progressing and developing. It's got a long-term trajectory up to 2050. And particularly in Asia, there's a lot of interesting things. In Korea, the KETS moves into phase 3 next year. It's covering 70% of all of the national GHG emissions. And it's demonstrating that ETS can work in an economy that's energy intensive, that's export focused. The big story will be in China when the national emissions trading system starts very shortly. That will be immediately the world's largest. We hear about Indonesia by 2024, that should be adopting a national ETS, and then Thailand, Vietnam, Chinese Taipei, Philippines, etc., all following this path. So I think the big challenge here is this is a powerful tool, but it needs to be aligned with net zero targets. So, for example, in Korea, there needs to be that the net zero that we've heard about needs to be converted into a 2030 target that's in line with net zero, and that needs to be converted into ETS cap, so ETS can really work to achieve that net zero. There's a big challenge in being able to decarbonize the power sector by passing through the carbon cost to power prices, and also a big challenge to scale up auctioning to really drive the polluter pays principle. So it's a very powerful tool. I think Korea's particularly through the passing through the carbon cost to electricity prices can show the way into how this can be done with government controlled prices. In terms of the US-China, I think that the leadership, the first point to make is that it starts with domestic policy. So US clearly needs to develop ambitious NDC with specific policies and measures across the key sectors, and these should be in line with achieving net zero emissions. In terms of China, China will need to develop an enhanced NDC, will need to have absolute targets. It will need to convert its ETS to having a fixed cap, not just a rate-based system. And that will enable the ETS to play a key role in enabling China to become net zero. And also China will need to demonstrate leadership by stopping its support for new coal power stations in the BRI countries. But then in terms of specific cooperation where US and China can play a role, I think certainly the US and Northeast Asia is a very fruitful area for cooperation. Obviously, that we've heard about the developments in China, Japan, Korea in terms of net zero, and this cooperation can cover almost 50% of global GHG emissions, and it can boost the likelihood of achievement of the Paris goals and provide a big influence to others. So this cooperation can share experience on policies and measures to achieve net zero, particularly carbon pricing and ETS. It can share clean energy transition experience, deep decarbonization in industry, also Article 6 implementation solutions. I think the US and China can also cooperate more closely bilaterally through reconstituting the US-China Climate Change Working Group. I think Northeast Asia can also cooperate with ASEAN countries. So we heard about the big gap in achievement of the goals. So ASEAN countries need to scale up and drive more national level net zero commitments, and the Northeast Asian countries can play a big part of that. China, but also Japan and Korea. Also China and India is a big fruitful area for cooperation. So India is one of the biggest challenges for climate action. And I think China, given the similarities of the development status, industrial structure, energy structure, can really share its very good experience in carbon pricing with India and really drive India to become more ambitious and to take more seriously the climate challenge. And then the final point is really about reviving the major economies forum on climate change and energy, potentially by combining with the ministerial on climate action. So I think there's a lot of cooperation opportunities. Okay. It's been really encouraging to hear what the previous speakers have said. And I think there's a big role that Korea, Japan, China, and the US can play.
Okay, that's a very insightful point. Thank you. I really appreciate it. And as you said, that I understand the US is going to convene the major leaders gathering within 100 days after Mr. Biden takes office. I'm really encouraged to see that happen. Well, now we will have time for discussion and interactions. I'd like to invite Mr. Lee Dong-gyu, who is the representing National Council on Climate and Environment as the Director General of the International Corporation. And you have been a tremendously wonderful climate negotiator, to my knowledge. So how do you see the development of this situation, especially with the U.S. administration, which will be quite climate sensitive? And not just with the U.S., but China and Asia and etc.
Thank you, Mr. Sang-Hyuk Kim. And good morning and good evening for others. And I am very happy and very comfortable. All of us in conference is going in the same direction. As okay. Mr. Sang-Hyuk Kim introduced me, I have engaged in the climate change negotiations since the Copenhagen conference, 2009. As you know, the climate change negotiation inclined to be a little bit confrontational until now. But I feel the wind is changing now. The great news is, of course, the return of the US to the Paris Agreement. And also, I really welcome the declaration of the China on the 2060 net zero. It will provide a good political momentum to tackle climate change and also relevant to the climate change negotiation. On the today's theme, personally, I think we have to take a little bit more structural approach. We already have the umbrella of the Paris Agreement, but how we can shift our commitment to actions depends on the implementation structure. The return of the U.S. to Paris Agreement is quite symbolic, but after that return of the U.S. to Paris Agreement, the U.S. and all of us should rebuild some structure for implementation of the Paris Agreement. In this regard, I totally agree with the suggestion of the Professor Victor. He said we must break big problems into small ones and work in the smallest group. At the beginning of the opening session, the Minister Joe showed his willingness and determination to participate in the climate change action. And just before the direct game, Ministry of the Industry, normally in Korea, Ministry of Industry is quite conservative, but I feel his eagerness and the willingness to join the climate action. So maybe as the Professor Victor said, we can divide some issues. For example, the speakers mentioned about the clean energy issues. I think there is some cooperation as already in action, but from the government, we need a little bit more intentional approach. So the US and China and Korea and even the Japan also share this climate energy issue. This is quite the focusing area. So for the governments can build some global or regional supply chains of clean energy. For example, hydrogen and green energy supplies will be the cooperation points. And also Mr. Kim said about his current cooperation with the US government. Maybe this bilateral cooperation could be expanded for a little bit multilateral. So two governments can invite the Chinese government and also the Japanese government.
Okay.
As we see, China and the US take half of the greenhouse gas emissions, and Korea and Japan has a huge part of this emission. So this kind of some regional and small group approach will provide some good momentum to promote and expel the global cooperation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lee. As time is running, well, as you rightly pointed out, we really welcome the cooperation between U.S. and China on climate issues. But you suggested that applying the David Victor's theory on club diplomacy. How about having quadrilateral cooperation, US, China, and Korea, and Japan? Before inviting Professor Shim, I'd like to get your feedback. David, how would you respond to his...
I think it's exactly the right idea. I think we have a period right now where the Biden administration isn't formally in power yet. It's actually not quite clear who's running things in Washington these days. So we need to do a little work on this, but I think we should lay the foundation with industrial ministries in all four of these countries, including the transition team in the US, about what that quadrilateral cooperation would mean. And there's going to be cooperation of different geometries. Quadrilateral, I'm sure the US-China bilateral is going to be very powerful. I think the US-European bilateral is going to be very important. And of course, the US-UK relationship because of the UK hosting of COP26.
Okay, thank you. Well, regarding the US and China relations, well, there has been the accumulating sense of tension and pressure and even confrontation, especially on the high-tech issues and security-related issues. But when it comes to climate change, there seems to be a mood for renewed cooperation. But there are many, many sensitive issues, even in the climate agenda between US and China. So Professor Shim, so there's issue on a kind of border adjustment issues, etc. How do you see the development, the relations of the US and China, Professor Shim?
Well, thank you, President Kim. I tend to think of the rivalry between China and the United States as something that we need to just pay attention to as we talk about the potential cooperation between these two great powers. The rivalry, the geographical contention between these two great powers are taking an impact on many different areas, and climate is definitely one of those areas that would be negatively impacted by this the international rivalry. That being said, I still see a great potential for these two countries to work together to make the world toward a much more livable place. And renewables would be one area, and probably nuclear energy is another area that these two countries can work together. And I see great potential for the US industries and the Chinese industries in these two great areas to work together, find climate-friendly solutions at an affordable price. But I have to just put some words of caution when it comes to employing what measures to employ to push or nudge China toward more climate-friendly policymaking. Trade measures, in general, are something that the Chinese government is really abhorrent for, and the border adjustment measures, whether it's directed by the European Union or directed by the United States, might draw the ire of the Chinese authority to act negatively in terms of just gaining momentum on collective action in terms of climate-friendly solutions. So I have to be, maybe I'm too realistic in terms of just thinking out our great strategy toward climate solutions, but maybe some kind of a compromise might be needed to push the climate agenda forward when it comes to working together with China. That's all I can say from the political perspective.
Thank you. David, to my understanding, Professor Shim and you stayed together at the Stanford University, to my knowledge. So how would you respond to his remark? And there are many hurdles, even though we really welcome the good relations with the US and China.
Well, I think Professor Shim is correct, and it's not just because of the common relationship to Stanford University. I think it's good politics. Look, a lot of the pressure on border adjustments right now is coming from Europe.
Right.
I understand why that is. There's been some talk about this in the US, but it's not real yet. I understand the reasons behind this, but I think the warning from Professor Shim is correct. I've been in 7 or 8 international meetings in the last 5 or 6 days, and this topic has come up every single time.
Right.
And I think given all the fragility that we have in the global economic system right now, if we accidentally destroy economic relations between these important countries at the same time we're trying to put the relations together on climate change, that they're going to set ourselves back.
Okay, thank you. Well, there is a very famous proverb which says, if you focus on the differences, then you would create conflict. But if you focus on the commonality or common things, it will enhance cooperation. I think, yeah. In that regard, I have a hope that there could be a kind of climate detente or green detente between the U.S. and China, and that would give us a good, positive impact on the geopolitiks of Northeast Asia. And Mr. Rich, you are in London, so it must be midnight or so. But if you have anything to add on the conversation, I welcome it. So.
Yeah, thank you. I think the...
Do you think we need a kind of American cap and trade legislation to make a carbon pricing happen?
Yeah, I think in terms of the carbon pricing, the role of carbon pricing can play a key role in decarbonising the power sector and also generate funds for deep decarbonisation in industry. We've heard quite a bit about the technological frontier. The key thing in the EU is that the innovation fund, which is generated from money from the EU ETS, is putting money towards hydrogen steel making or CEC, carbon capture utilization in cement. And so I think that the decarbonisation of the industrial sector is highly dependent on an effective carbon price. So an ETS can be very effective in achieving that, both in China and Korea and the US. In the power sector, you can have renewable energy policies, but they're not always the most cost effective. So I think that the ETS can play a key role in supporting to make coal more expensive in comparison to gas and renewables. So obviously US already has good experience in California and RGGI on carbon pricing, but I think China, the great thing about carbon pricing cooperation is that both US and China have good experience to share with each other. China has very good experience from the pilots. It's got the national ETS, which will be the world's largest in a few months. And they've got some very good experience. And I think that this could be a very, as you say, it can be a very positive area for cooperation. It can reduce the tension because it's a more diplomatically easier topic. And there's definitely a strong appetite. And I think Korea should play a part in that as well, because Korea is the front runner ETS in Asia and has better experience than China at the national level, and Japan needs to follow quickly as well. But I think because all these Northeast Asian jurisdictions have signed up to net zero, there's a much more stronger urgency to get proper carbon pricing policies in place, and the US needs something at the national level in place. So it can't achieve everything through subsidies or through renewable energy stimulation. So,
my last question to Professor David Victor. You know, for 4 countries, I mean, quadrilateral countries, US, China, Korea, and Japan have something in common. That is nuclear power. I know many people do not like nuclear power, but I had a deep dialogue with the head of the IEA, and he said that if you have nuclear power, please keep it in your energy mix because it is really low carbon. And to my knowledge, John Kerry, who is going to be the special envoy of the United States, said very favorably for the future generation nuclear power plant. And the three countries, China, Japan, and Korea, have very good infrastructures and skills for nuclear power, even though Korea is trying to phase out nuclear power plant. You have any view on this?
Yeah, I think this is vitally important. Nuclear power is a huge source of useful energy at zero carbon emissions. I think one of the things we're learning is that there are two nuclear industries in the world right now. There's the nuclear industry in the Western countries, where what we need to do is stop shutting reactors prematurely, like in the United States. The situation in Japan is politically very difficult for understandable reasons. And then and I think Korea is now in this situation. And then there's another industry where Korea is actually a leader, which is the emerging market industry. And the Chinese are now building more reactors than anybody else in the world. The export project, Korean-built pressurized water reactor in Abu Dhabi, is a very, very important export project. And so I think if we're going to have more countries around the world use nuclear power safely and help us address the climate problem, with nuclear playing a role, not the only role, but a role, we got to have a vital export industry. And I think that's a potentially really, really important role for Korea. The US is going to have a big, big say in that because of the nuclear materials agreements, such as the one between the United States and Abu Dhabi, that made that project possible.
Okay, thank you. Well, I really wish we could have more time, but time is really running out. And well, I always say this to my students and my fellow friends, and then, well, if not now, then when? And if not us, then who? And Karen, who is the MC today, is my student. So let's do something right now together for the next chapter. So this is it. Thank you. And stay with us for the second session. That would be really, really important topic, dealing with climate and green finance. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you all for your presentations and discussion. I think we all especially enjoyed the imagery invoked by some of the speakers, such as the atmosphere does not recognize the Paris Agreement, and when the tide goes down, what will we be wearing?